I'd like to welcome you to an event with David Malouf, his novel Ransom, and Professor Bill Ashcroft. My name's Stephen Mukey. I'd like first of all to acknowledge the Gadigal and Eora peoples on whose country we meet tonight and acknowledge our respect of your elders, past and present. I need hardly remind you of mobile phone protocols. A phone going off in the middle of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is one thing, but when David Malouf is reading, one man's voice, creating a symphony with words alone, that's quite another order of disturbance. UNSWriting, UNSWriting, New South Writing for short, is in the context of English media and performing arts and FAS. It's about cultivating flows of ideas and good writing, connecting writers with students and publishers. We've had speakers such as Andrew Croom, Tom Keneally, Kate Kennedy to date, and Yi-Yun Lee coming up on the 19th of May as part of the Sydney Writers' Festival, which is the major literary event of the East Coast. And the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences is proud to call it our partner. For the first time with this up-and-coming festival, UNSW is the festival's university partner. And a couple of other thank yous. Here on campus, the Centre for Performing and Research, CPRU. Thanks for your help. I have to thank Sue Goldfish and her remarkable team, as well as the FAS Marketing Office, Kate Clark and Rebecca Straker. New South Writing was Sunil Badami's brainchild. He's here tonight, so I'd like to sincerely thank you, Sunil, for the extraordinary energy you put in last year to get this whole show up and running. We like to think of Sydney Pen as a partner. You've seen the slide, I think. So today, we carry on the tradition of the empty chair to honour and raise awareness of writers imprisoned for their dedication to telling the truth. Today's chair is for Muhammad Yassin, and thanks Dr. Bonnie Cassidy, President of Sydney Pen, for bringing Muhammad Yassin's chair tonight. And David Malouf is, of course, on the Pen board. There are some brochures downstairs. You can join Pen if you, on the way out, if you like. My pleasant task is to introduce Professor William Ashcroft, my colleague here in the English Media and Performing Arts, who graciously accepted the nonetheless enviable position of sharing the podium with one of Australia's greatest writers. Professor Bill Ashcroft studied at the University of Sydney and the Australian National University, Canberra, and has taught in several universities around the world, most recently at the University of Hong Kong. Bill is one of the founding figures in post-colonial studies. Only recently, his co-authored book, The Empire Writes Back, which was one of the first to define this field in literature in 1989, celebrated its 20th anniversary after numerous editions. Since then, he's achieved international renown in post-colonial studies with many more publications, too numerous to mention here. So the course of the events this evening, the two gentlemen will be in conversation. David would read a bit. First he'll read, then the conversation. That conversation will lead into possibilities for your questions. You've had the opportunity to read Ransom, so I'm sure your questions will be both erudite and hopefully not too long. Then you have the opportunity of meeting David afterwards as he signs the copies of his various books. So there's quite a few the UNSW bookshop has kindly brought for sale this evening. So Bill, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and congratulations for these continuing events. It's a very great pleasure for me because, as Stephen said, I did go to Sydney University and I was a student when David Malouf was a junior lecturer. And I remember him well, and I remember the poetry readings in the Cell Block Theatre, aptly named perhaps. But today I stand here and say without any equivocation that David Malouf is probably the most significant living Australian writer. He's poet, novelist, short story writer, dramatist, essayist, lecturer, even librettist. He's received both critical and popular acclaim for his works, winning a number of national and international prizes. And I'm going to go through them to assure you that it's all worth the entry fee. An Imaginary Life won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in '79. Flyaway Peter won the Age Book of the Year Award in '82. The The Great World won the Miles Franklin Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Fiction in 1991. Remembering Babylon won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in 93. In 94 was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, won the Miles Franklin Prize, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize Asia Pacific region and the Prix Féminin Étranger, and was awarded the first International Impact Dublin Literary Award, the world's largest literary award, in 1996. Conversations at Curlew Creek was nominated for the Age Book of the Year Award in 96 and Miles Franklin Award in 97. He was awarded the Neustadt International Prize for Literature in 2000. He won the inaugural Asia Australia Literary Award and the Prime Minister's Literary Award in 2008. His latest novel, Ransom, has been shortlisted for the Premier's Literary Award, called the Christina Stead Prize, for the third time. And if he wins it, he'll be only the second person in Australia to win it 3 times. But unlike another Australian novelist whose publisher once remarked that he had more prizes than readers, David is both widely read and greatly loved. And his novels are still in print, which is no mean effort for an Australian novelist. And let's face it, one reason that he is widely read is that his novels are great to set on courses because they're so rich in cultural complexity. Now, in fact, there are few writers who address so forcefully and incisively the enduring issues of Australian cultural life, and this was indicated by his 1998 Boyer lectures on ABC Radio, which explore how living in one hemisphere and inheriting our culture from another affects who we are and the sort of world we make for ourselves in Australia. And indeed, there are few authors more amenable to a post-colonial reading in Australia. Malouf canvasses the entire range of issues that affect a society inheriting one culture and struggling to develop its own. The issue of language and its relation to place, the struggle that occurs within an inherited language, the creation of place and its relation to identity, the society's relation to its Indigenous people, the project of imagining and representing a world freed of its colonial inheritance, the anxieties of Australia seeking a place in the world in 2 world wars. These issues and many more define the unique skills of a writer who can balance the large cultural picture with the most intimate and finely worked detail. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present you with Australia's foremost living novelist, David Malouf.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this very beautiful building, I must say, and to be talking at this university. I'm a writer these days who is much more concerned with writing than with publishing. And I mean, I think a writer should always be more concerned with writing than publishing. You know, you eventually get round to the publishing, but the writing is something you do because you are driven to do it for whatever reason, and you do it for yourself. So I should say about this book, Ransom, which was published last year, and much spoken about as my first novel for 14 years, that in fact I wrote it in 2002, and it was finished, I think, by the end of 2002. And I did then what I've done almost all my life with things that I've recently written. I put it away. It was a book I wrote very much for myself because there were things there that I wanted to write about, and I'll say something about that in a moment. But I also said to myself that I wasn't quite sure that it was a book that other people would be interested in, especially people who would look at the book and say, well, how does this fit into the rest of his work? And why are we as Australian readers in 2003, as it might have been, being asked to interest ourselves in the Iliad? I then, as I say, put the book away. I went back to my usual cache of unfinished stories and finished a book of stories which came out almost immediately after that, which was Every Move You Make. And then I got together a lot of poems I'd had for quite a long time and produced a book, Typewriter Music. And then I thought, well, maybe I will go back again and look at this book, Ransom. And that's when I took it to a publisher and it got published. The book has astonished me because in a way that I could never have predicted, it has been extraordinarily popular. And huge numbers of people have read the book. And I still ask myself quite what it is in the book that readers who wouldn't necessarily be interested in this material have been drawn to. And I have come to the conclusion that it's because it's a book that presents itself very simply as a story. And that one of the things it's about is about storytelling, and it's about the kinds of stories we tell and why we tell those stories and what storytelling means to us. And I've always believed that storytelling was one of those absolutely human activities that fulfills an absolutely human need. And it's interesting, perhaps, to consider that, if that was true in primitive times when people sat down and listened to a professional storyteller, and if people went on doing that for thousands of years in non-literate places, and if we all sat at our mother's knee and listened to short stories being told, somehow there is something in that activity itself that deeply appeals to us and that we feel we need. And that one of the things that Bill and I perhaps might talk about. The actual subject of the book really does go back, and it's in the afterwards, so I won't explain it and tell it again. But, I first heard I was a reader, but at 9, for some reason, I had never, although I'd read several Dickens novels, I'd never actually come across the Troy story. And I heard that one afternoon, rainy afternoon, when we should have been out playing tunnel ball, couldn't do it, and the teacher decided to read us something, and she read to us from the Iliad, a children's version of it. And I was devastated because the story didn't finish. The bell rang and then we all went home. And I wanted to know what happened. I didn't know then, in fact, that the Iliad itself ends on something like an unfinished note. Why it all meant so much to me was because this was 1943, and I was living in Brisbane, and we were living in a city in which every building was sandbagged, and which what we were doing was waiting for the invading army to come, with no knowledge then, because history hadn't yet happened, that we were not going to suffer the same kind of fate that the Trojans suffered. So when I heard that story, it wasn't a fairy story. It was a story that touched absolutely on my own kinds of anxieties and fears. So that's one of the reasons why several times in writing I've gone back to the Troy material. And one of the things is, I think, again, that material is itself something that speaks to people over and over again in different ages about certain kinds of essential and primitive anxieties about the fall of the city. The city is a sacred construct which represents the best of everything in us in terms of civil behavior and civil aspirations. And the fall of a city is a terrible, terrible thing. So, that is material itself which strikes us deeply. Going back to the actual Iliad, I didn't really want to retell what's, after all, a classically told and unmatchable work. I mean, we sometimes forget that 27 centuries ago, at the very beginning of our literate culture, this work appeared, and in my terms, has actually never been matched by anything that has been written since. There are great books, and Shakespeare, you know, with all his work, might stand beside it. But actually, I know of no single work that is as great and casts such a long shadow as the Iliad. So there's no reason to tell it again. What I was interested in is if there weren't some little places in that telling where things are not told, which one could now begin to tell. And one of those things is the story of Priam's childhood, which doesn't appear anywhere else as far as I know. And the other thing was to look again at that heroic world, and without, and you know, the Iliad is built entirely on that notion of the hero and of a heroic world in operation. To look again at that material, and without really wanting to write a work that was anti-heroic or mock-heroic, nevertheless, because we don't really need such things, write a work that was non-heroic, and to take this heroic material and present it in some kind of non-heroic way. And that really was to look at Priam and see his kind of heroism, which is a kind of moral and imaginative heroism, as being the equal, or in fact more important than the heroism of an Ajax or an Achilles. Because it is another kind of human action that he's being heroic in. And the other thing was to sneak into that world where he could never appear and never have a voice, someone who is clearly there but never actually appears in Homers Iliad. And that is somebody like the character I've called Somax, who's sort of an ordinary working man going on with an ordinary life. And then by putting him side by side with Priam, to see what that might allow us to see about how you might talk about Priam in a different way. So that's what I was trying to do. The thing I would say about that is the novel is constructed quite simply, a bit like a classical French play, to this extent that it's about a single confrontation in the end between Achilles and Priam. And really what the book is setting out to do is to provide you with enough knowledge of both of those characters and their situation to make the dramatic moment when it comes fully accessible to you. But I also took the advantage of the Priam-Somax relationship and that journey to write in the middle of it a kind of small comic pastoral, which is what that journey becomes. And also in doing that, to do something that belongs peculiarly to the novel. Because when I say a French drama, you know, a French drama is based on strict Aristotelian principles. You know, takes place in a single time, which the book does. It's about a single event, which is the book does. And in Aristotelian terms, everything should be irrelevant. But the novel is a form that was invented to take advantage of the interesting and appealing and ultimately wonderful irrelevancies of ordinary life. And so it really is a kind of hymn to praise, particularly in that middle section, to what Nabokov would call lovely irrelevancy. You know, and he says himself that that's the place where the novel discovers its greatest truths. So it's a book which is also about the novel itself. Perhaps I won't read so that we can have our conversation, but it might be that some point in the conversation, you know, we can find an opportunity for reading. And polish your questions, because I like questions.
That gets rid of about half of my questions. Thanks very much. You've explained how the interest that the Iliad has for you. I'm just curious, where else have you talked about Troy in your work? I mean, where has it cropped up?
There are a couple of poems. There's a poem called Decade's End, which refers to Troy. There's a poem which is about that moment of hearing that story for the first time, and it's called Episode from an Early War, and it's quoted in part in the afterword there. Then a few years ago, when I wrote a little book called Untold Tales, I told 2 Greek stories in that. One is a version of the Achilles Patroclus situation where Patroclus goes out in disguise. And I mean, I played around with that in a completely unjustified by any, Greek thing concerned. Because what happens there is that Odysseus is the person who suggests it, and he suggests that Patroclus will be playing a trick on the army. But of course, what he's actually doing is, by becoming a kind of simulacrum and going out there, he's not only calling into question the whole sort of honour thing, but he's really cutting away the ground under anybody who would want to present themselves heroically ever again. So there's that. That's a very kind of postmodern piece. And maybe that's it.
Yeah, I suppose everyone looks at the priam Achilles encounter as central, but I think there's something else going on. I looked at the film Troy in preparing for this conversation, and that was probably a really bad idea, because it's full of
bad film.
It's full of bloodshed and violence and beautiful women and what Peter Conrad calls Brad Pitt's fantastically sculpted buttocks.
Yeah.
And I think that, but in a way it was good to look at that. This is what spectacle can do with a big story. But what happens with Ransom is you go immediately into the minutiae, what you call the irrelevancies, but it seemed to me immediately that this is a book about what the novel can do.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's the way you see the novel developing, because in fact, as it develops, there's something else happens. It's not the story of Priam and Achilles doesn't seem to me to be the centre of the book. I'll talk to that in a minute. But before we do, I just want to go and talk a little bit about poetry and the language of poetry. No, when I was a student and you were a lecturer, you were a poet. And
Only.
This was before Jono was published in 75, so that gives you an idea how long ago it was. But I would say that there is possibly nobody and no Australian author anyway, who employs poetic language in fiction so well. I mean, the economy, the rhythm, and in lines like, when Achilles is standing over Hector, he's cut his ankles, his heels, and he says he was waiting for the rage to fill him. That would be equal to the outrage he was committing. And I think these lines are poetry, they're poetic. And what, you might want to refer to that review I made many years ago, but let me ask this question. Are you a better poet as a novelist than you are as a poet?
Oh, I don't know. Look, I think that's for other people to decide.
That's a conversation
stopper. No, that's something for other people to decide. But I think I don't myself see that when people say somebody's a poetic prose writer, that's necessarily, that's just describing one of the kind of prose that can exist. But it is often used as a sort of put down, I think. I'm not suggesting you're doing that.
No.
But all that means, and the language that you use in prose is never really like that of poetry, because the language of poetry is much, much more dense, and you're asked to read it in a much different way. And it comes certainly in a very different way when you're writing it. But all that can mean inside a prose work is that you want the words to have the same kind of individual and immediate reverberation that they would have in a poem. And you want the language to be musical in a way that it would be in a poem. And I don't know, I can't tell whether that means that people have to read in a different way, whether they have to read more slowly, whether they you wouldn't want to hold them up so much in getting through the sentences that they were not actually following the action. Now, all of those are problems for the person who's writing the book. The only way he'll ever know whether he solved them or not is in what the reader experiences. But you know, I mean, when you're writing a poem, you're really trying to slow down very, very much the reader's apprehension of a sentence, of a line, of a cadence, you know, through a line. You don't really want to do that in prose, but you still want it to move on as fast as it can and to embody action, but it doesn't seem to me a bad thing if along the way the words get loaded enough for that experience to be a rich one.
I think that's really a good point, because I think that economy of language that poetry brings is perfect for what you're trying to do in the novel, in going below the big story, you know, to see the minutiae. And immediately when you get into the novel, Achilles is a person. You know, he's not a hero from classical legend. He's a person who longs for his mother. Just this line: he was 5, then 6. She was his secret. He floated in the long, soft swirlings of her hair. And in lines like that, you know, you get the sense of real humanity. And that's what I think you talk about irrelevancies and the minutiae, but it's the humanity that I think is really powerful there. And I want to think about, you said you wrote it in 2002. Now, I'll just throw this in, but one reviewer has suggested that the contemporary significance of the Greek tribes invading the sophisticated metropolis of Troy is like is to liken the 4 square towers of Troy to the World Trade Center. And so, you know, is that resonance there, do you think, or is it just drawing too long a bow? Is it going too far-fetched?
Oh, I think it's very difficult when you're a writer to know to what extent events out there in the world have actually shaped what you're doing. I read a lot of novels these days, especially American novels, and what they're often about is a man dying of cancer, usually prostate cancer, I must say. And you know, nevertheless, I find myself saying, this is a post-9/11 novel. You know, what this novel is really about is about the trauma of the loss of everything from inside. And so it's true, I think, that events like that, you know, like once, say, the Holocaust happened, not when it happened, but many years afterwards when it got into people's consciousness, I think it had a huge effect on the kinds of books that people wrote and the kind of poetry they wrote. So, but it's very difficult because often those things are displaced. And what you're getting is not dealing with the thing directly at all, but dealing with it indirectly through the kind of traumatic emotion it's created in people. So I can't say, you know, maybe if the first time around it was about the Japanese invasion of Brisbane, which never happened, it might well be that working on that material in 2002, one of the things that drew me to it was the sight of those towers falling, because that's the moment. It's for us in the most extraordinary way in the 21st century. It's the visual picture of a plane going into those 2 buildings and they're crumbling and falling that is the real key to our emotion rather than the thought that all these people are dying. I think for the physical disintegration in real time of something that we're looking at, it was just an extraordinary thing. So maybe.
Well, just something different. You retain all the gods, Iris and Hermes, in your novel, and I wonder why. I mean, particularly when Iris comes up with a particularly modern concept of chance. So how do you sort of resolve that kind of?
Well, look, reading the Greek world from a modern perspective, one of the things we can see quite clearly is that one of the uses of those religious figures in Greek life was to explain how humans work. And so, all those gods are really the embodiments either of natural forces, and there's a most amazing example of that, of how good the Greeks were about that. I just came to this university, in fact, the other day to talk about mythology to the drama students at NIDA, and I brought with me a version I did of Hippolytus, and there's a moment at the end of that where Hippolytus has been exiled by Theseus, and he goes out in his chariot, and Theseus calls in an old debt that is owed to him by Poseidon, the god of the sea, and he says, "I'm calling in this debt now, get him." And Hippolytus is going along the shore, and suddenly, and we get all this in a description by an eyewitness, he looks out at to sea, and he sees this enormous wave coming, which is described as kind of bulls charging. And the horses panic, and the wave takes the chariot and completely destroys it. Now that is an absolutely precise scientific description of a tsunami at work after an underwater eruption. So, what the Greeks were doing is they were looking at those things, and instead of explaining them only in a scientific way, they would mythologize them so they become a piece of action, and the sea is an active figure in terms of Poseidon. They do that also for almost all psychological states, for greed, for lust, for whatever it is. Don't want to go into all of that. But just as we have found a kind of mythologizing of all of that in psychology, and in psychoanalysis and all sorts of Freudian, Jungian stuff, that's how the Greeks did it. So the religion that they've got is a way of embodying in non-abstract ways the human forces inside humans and forces inside the universe that you're dealing with. And to that's one of the reasons why, if you read the Iliad, almost all the action concerning the gods is comic. They can be comic figures. They don't have to be taken all that seriously. They kind of know that what they are is really objectifications of human folly and confusion. So it seemed to me that you could include the gods here if you offered them as a way of seeing something that was purely psychological. So, particularly when Iris turns up to Priam, he doesn't actually see Iris. He sees a vanishing iridescence, which is the hem of her garment. And he decides that what he has just dreamt or thought up has been dictated to him by Iris. It's a bit different with the Hermes character because he really is a kind of, and he belongs to the comic world of that journey, really. He's a kind of, he's a cheeky kind of figure, but he's also a piece of cheek on the part of the writer. Really that thing of saying, if you believe this, you'll believe anything, but I'm going to convince you.
Yeah. But the fact that Iris talks about chance opens the way for this very moving account of Priam's capture and rescue by Hesione, his sister. And it's really, he's standing at a crossroads at that moment, isn't he? He's at a crossroads. His life could have been entirely different, with just and so in a sense, that is so tremendously powerful because it gives flesh to that abstract.
Yeah, but look, the other thing that all of that does is, and it goes back to something you were saying earlier about the poetic quality of the writing. Look, the thing that I've always been interested in, more than anything in fiction, is what's going on in people's heads. The books are almost entirely about people's inner lives, not about action at all. And you know, almost all of my books have been taken out as film options. And that's great, because they pay for that. But you really keep, every time anybody comes to you with one of those, you say, are you serious? If you looked at this book, nothing happens. It all takes place in someone's head. And you know, if there's a scene between two characters, they're both sitting there saying nothing, and you're being told what they're thinking. And it's because the writing is very visual, which is another thing, that people are misled into believing that you could make a film of this. So one of the things that I'm interested, one of the things why I went to all that material about Priam is because what I was able to do was something that Homer certainly wouldn't do and doesn't do, which is to provide this man with a whole inner life and a whole set of inner confusions and memories. I mean, he's like several characters in my books. That becomes for him not a choice that was made, but an alternative life that he's not living, which is a kind of ghost life which he has always been living, and which undermines deeply his sense of his own integrity in a kind of way. Now, that will never happen in Homer, but that story allowed me to do that with him, and that's kind of what I'm more interested in than pure action.
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, that's really striking about Priam then is that he visualises the whole thing, the cart and going down, as though it's already happened, and he knows that is what he's going to do. And so it's not just the inner life, it's the power of the imagination, and this is where the power of the novel comes in. Because he imagines, and what is imagined then can be achieved. And this can be done in words. I just want to read a little passage, if I could, where Hecuba gets extremely anxious about what he's doing. And he says, you know, we have the opportunity to act for ourselves, to try a different course. She wishes she had misheard. Words are powerful. They too can be the agents of what is new, of what is conceivable, and can be thought and let loose upon the world. And that seems to me exactly the power of the novel, to imagine what could be. And that's why the story has such purchase, because it is the power of the imagination. And it's very interesting, because how does that fit in then with your desire to give the minutiae, the irrelevancies of ordinary life? You've got this huge power of the imagination. It seems to me that sets Priam on a journey that...
Yeah, well, the imagination is one thing, but you see, one of the other things that the novel does is it takes a lot of time about observing the way the world is. And it's a lot of the interest of the novel. It's not description, it's rendering the specificity and density of the world we're in. And one of the things, I mean, Priam has never had any real experience of that. And one of the things that journey provides him with is the possibility of experiencing all of that firsthand. And that's a lot of that's what that section is about. He also has the ideal companion, because he's got a companion who has lived with that all his life and knows nothing else. And so everything that for Somax is just ordinary life is for Priam a kind of revelation, because he's never looked at any of those things. And what he realizes is that almost everything he is seeing and hearing, in terms of his previous life, has no use. It's got interest, but it's got no use. And that's partly what the irrelevancy is that the novel has, I think, always been interested in.
Yeah. So Somax is the cart driver whose donkey cart takes Priam down to Achilles with all the treasure. And he's a complete invention of yours. How did you come up with him? And, or why? Because
Look,
I think...
one morning when I was sitting fiddling around with all of this, the idea for him came to me. I couldn't tell you when or how or why. I mean, what working really as a writer largely is about is sitting down and not knowing what you're doing or where something is going, and having something happen. And, you know, I mean, each morning when you set yourself down to it, usually without any fixed idea of where the book is now going, you're hoping that one of those things is going to happen. And, you know, one of those times, I would have said, what if?
I think it's a stroke of genius, because what Somax does is shift the whole centre of gravity of the novel away from Priam and Achilles to Priam's transformation from this almost godlike king to a person who can actually experience the real world. And it's the novel's capacity to give flesh to that real world that's really so powerful. And so that middle section of the 5 chapters is really the centre, the moral and structural centre, because it's Priam's transformation. And it seems to me, again, this is the sort of allegory of the novel itself, allowing you to experience real life, the minutiae of life, and how powerful and extraordinary that is. And he'd never actually thought about the fact that these little griddle cakes, required certain kinds of ingredients and a way of making them. It's a brilliant demonstration of a man coming into contact with the ordinary life. I think it seems to me something that the novel does brilliantly, and it's much more than, well, it is what's going on inside him, and nothing much happens in that whole section, but there's a huge transformation.
Well, he's kind of, it seems to me, ready for that, because he's already sort of thinking that his whole life, that whole stance he has as king, is like he thinks of his real self as being kind of rattling around like a pea in a golden shell sort of thing. So he's already half prepared when he goes out there as something that he is fearful of, that adventure is going to be something that either makes or breaks him and will reveal something to him. He also, he's also understands, well, first of all, he's trying to retell his own story. He's trying to make quite certain. See, he knows that the story that's going to happen and that will be told of him is that Troy falls, he is killed, dragged out into the streets and torn to pieces by dogs. And he does not want that to be the last thing we remember of him. So if that's not going to happen, and everybody in this world is concerned about the story that will be told about them, he has to do something so extraordinary that what he's done will replace his death as the thing that is told about him. And so, he's got something invested in all of that. But he also has some kind of idea that if he can bring off what he wants to bring off, which is going to Achilles just as a man and a father, that somehow he will be offering Achilles, and that's what we're concerned with too, the way of breaking out of his own trap that he's caught in. So I think somewhere in the book, the idea is put forward by Priam that the real ransom that he's taking to Achilles is the possibility of doing something also that is unprecedented and that will free him. So, I mean, a lot of the book is about redemption.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there's this line, he has stepped into a space that till now was uninhabited and has found a way to fill it. And I think it's a perfect description of what he's done. But in the process, there's something else. I mean, that's extremely important. And again, it's part of what Priam's transformation is about. And if I could just read this, and this section where he's really overwhelmed in a way by Somax's life and by the ordinary. He says, it was as if you had found yourself peering through the crack in a door. Exciting, Priam found, this imagining himself into a situation he would never have dreamed of acting out, and saw clearly for a moment into the fellow's life, his world, the world of the daughter-in-law too. And, you know, yet again, we see this is the power of words, the power of the imagination, the power of the novel to do this. So in a sense, Priam's transformation is a confirmation of what can be achieved through the power of story, but not just the power of story, the ability to give flesh to the ordinary.
That image of peering through a door and what you grasp is something that I do go back to, I must say. I think all writers, little writers in the making, and I've said this often, become very, very, very expert eavesdroppers and voyeurs. And I spent an awful lot of my time in that first house I lived in at 12 Edmondson Street, hiding behind doors and listening and peering at things. But all children do it, because how else are they ever going to discover what's going on? I mean, your parents are never going to tell you what's going on. But I think there are some people who become very, very expert at it, and all writers do. And, you know, almost everything that a writer uses as material is something that he picks up either by eavesdropping or peering through cracks in doors. So, and I've said again, it's in that essay that I wrote recently on experience. That threshold experience is a really, really important one. There's a wonderful quotation that Henry James has about a woman novelist who gets praised for the fact that she writes a book. I don't know who it is. It could be George Eliot. Writes a book about a Protestant family in France. And people say to her, how on earth did you get to understand the workings of that world? You know, you must have spent an awful lot of time observing or listening. And she says, no, once in a hotel, I was going up some stairs and a door was ajar, and through it I glimpsed a French Protestant family at supper. And that's what you need. That's what a writer can take and grab and run with. But it's almost always a sort of threshold experience, something glimpsed through a door. So, I mean, that partly explains that image.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, there's this very interesting combination of the imagination and the power of words and the ordinary. I remember you saying once that the things that you write are absolutely real at the time you're writing them. And would that be true for this book as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that you know I think writers are really, really naive in the same way that children are, and that, you know, when you're writing, Doesn't matter how, and I'm sure this is true of science fiction writers or anybody, doesn't matter how improbable it is, if you're fully imagining it, then you're there and it's happening. Partly that thing you just said is, when I wrote Jono, I used to still go around to schools a bit, and people used to always say to me about some section in the book, did this really happen? And it was true. What I found myself saying as the simplest truth of all of that was, well, yes, it happened while I was writing it, because I couldn't remember any longer what was real and what I had imagined and put in the book. And that's good, because it tells you that the book is seamless in some kind of way.
Great. Achilles too, we've sort of left him out a bit, but because I think really the centre of the novel is Priam's transformation, but Achilles too has a glimpse of through a door, doesn't he? When he sees the women preparing Hector's body, and it's, you know, the life of the hero suddenly has margins, and he can see beyond that. It's a sort of threshold experience for him. And
yeah, that's great. That was very interesting to me, because there are women in the Iliad. Priam treats Helen absolutely impeccably, you know, with the greatest possible courtesy. And the scenes between Hector and Andromache as domestic scenes are wonderfully written and observed and very, very human. And but it seemed to me that there's another way in which women must be there but are never mentioned in those things. And that laying out and the place where the washing gets done seemed to me to be another place where you could open up a bit of the Iliad which is not there and do something in the crack.
Yeah. I wonder if, well, I just might finish with a criticism from a review of which you might respond to. And, you know, this fellow says, Ransom disappoints because it's neither humble enough nor brash enough when it takes Homer on. It falls between the two stools, neither true enough to Homer nor sufficiently untrue to him. I wonder how you'd respond. You might want to just say bugger off, you know. But,
I just think you just have to say, you know, I mean, every reader will respond in their own kind of way. And if you've written something that every reader kind of responded to in the same way, there'd be something wrong with it. Look, it's quite interesting. To me, just looking at the reviews, there are hardly any reviews of that kind in Australia. One slightly. It was quite a common response to the book in England. Not, again, in America, which is quite interesting to me. And it's got something to do, I think, with people's attitude to writing or to literature or something.
Or who owns high culture.
I was going to say, it's got a lot to do with who owns... Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
David, I wonder if you'd read a little bit for us now.
Oh, look, what I usually end up reading at these things is a bit right from the end, because one of the things that happens at the end is the kind of only survivor here is Somax. And so he becomes like a kind of Homer, because he's telling as a story the little bit that he's experienced of all of this. So it's sort of, you know, it's however many centuries it is before Homer and the other people have got round to doing it. But he becomes the first storyteller of any of this kind of material. And all he's doing is telling the bit of it that he knows. In the early days, while Troy still stands solid and gleaming on its high hill, the figures he has to speak of, Priam, Hecuba, Achilles, will still, in the minds of his listeners, be sharers of their own world, creatures like themselves of flesh and blood. Later, when Troy has become just another long, windswept hilltop, its towers reduced to rubble, its citizens scattered or carried off like Hecuba and Hector's wife Andromache and Cassandra and the other Trojan women into exile and slavery, all he has to tell, which was once as real as the itch under his tunic and the licy cracks between his nails, will have become the stuff of legend, half folktale, half an old man's empty bragging. So many stories. He tells them to anyone who will share a drink with him. On summer evenings under the big misshapen sycamore at the tavern door, nodding off at times in mid-sentence so that his listeners creep away smiling and shake their heads, or by the light of a single oil lamp and with a young one on his lap, one of his many great-grandchildren, on long nights when the entire village is holed up against invaders behind the doors of the fortified barn. Those who sit intent as children and give themselves up to these old tales will have heard them 100 times before and know every detail and unlikely turn. The meeting in the tamarisk grove with the impudent fellow who was in fact the god Hermes in the guise of an Achaean warrior, a dandified youth with golden tresses and a scent, it was this that gave him away, like gillyflowers. How in a quiet spot beyond the same tamarisk grove, he had managed without too much trouble to tempt the old king Priam, who had never heard of such a thing, to cool his feet in the running stream and taste one of the little griddle cakes his daughter-in-law was such a dab hand at. How he had spent the night in the open yard beside Achilles' hut in the Greek camp and was given gobbets of meat to eat that the great Achilles himself had sliced and roasted, with scallions and the finest wheaten bread to soak up the grease, and had slept very comfortably afterwards under a lamb's wool rug provided one of Achilles' squires. His listeners do not believe him, of course. He is a known liar. He is 100 years old and drinks too much. What he has to tell did happen, or so they say, but to someone else. Idaeus the man was called, King Priam's herald. Is it likely that such a figure, a king's herald, would have griddle cakes in his satchel? Do great kings dabble their feet in icy streams? This old fellow, like most storytellers, is a stealer of other men's tales, of other men's lives.
Thank you very much.
David, if I may call you that,
Yeah.
I would love to hear you speak a little about how you imagine your readers and how important they are to your creative work. Because you said before that you felt just driven to work by some inner fire that makes you produce these beautiful things. But how do you imagine and understand and think about your readers as you're doing this?
Well, when I say, what this fire is really puzzlement. I think most writers are people, again, going back to that idea of writers being particularly naive and childlike. Other people seem to get to a point where all those questions they have about why people behave the way they do or what happens kind of get, they feel like they've got the answers to it. I think writers are people who go on being absolutely puzzled. And it's always some kind of question, some kind of puzzle that's got hold of you, and you think, why? Something you've seen or heard, and it starts nagging at you, and you think, I don't know why this, why can't I just let this go? And that's really what leads you to do the writing. And what I think of often as as an image is the world being out there being this kind of great object with thousands and thousands of little hooks. And one of those little hooks gets into you and you can't let it go. And what the writing is that hook connecting with whatever is inside you and dragging it all up. And when that's out there, you've got the book. I've always written only because I'm following some kind of trail like that. And quite often I've got into the middle of the book and I said, I don't think anybody is ever going to be interested in this. But go on and finish it. And then when you've finished it, you say, well, maybe somebody will be interested because I'm not so peculiar that if it's engaged me for 6 months or a year or 2 years or whatever it is, it won't engage somebody, to read. And so you publish it. So really, I don't actually think of the reader as being anybody except somebody like me. And but I certainly never. I mean, always when you're writing, you try to get it as clear as possible, but that's for yourself. But I never say to myself, what will the reader think of this, or can I say that, or any of those things. So, the quick answer is I don't consider the reader at all, but when the reader I have in mind is somebody who is like me. So I have some respect for the reader.
I'm just wondering about your influences, and I suppose I particularly have in mind, when you're talking about rewriting Homer, the figure that comes to mind is Joyce. Yeah. And in your discussion, when you were talking about the treatment of the ordinary, the idea of the or the non-heroic, or the morally or imaginatively heroic, and the anti-militarism of it. And I'm wondering, first of all, is Joyce an influence? And if so, is it enabling or disabling, or perhaps he's not at all an influence? Or if not, do you have any other influences when it came to particularly rewriting Homer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think of... See, one of the things that happens in Joyce is it doesn't really seem to me that he's really dealing with Homer. He's taking the form of a Homeric work and allowing that to exist as a kind of shadow form behind something else. Because, I mean, that book really, Ulysses is a book about the most minute observation of daily life. And, I mean, it is, at its time, extraordinarily original, not just in the writing, but kind of in the interest. And, I can almost see him saying to himself, how is this going to be anything but the most amorphous work, which consists of things so ordinary that they have no significance, and then thinking, perhaps, that they can be organized with a shadow epic behind them, which will give them a kind of significance, but will also be ironic in that all the action is anti-heroic. But, that seems to me to be the use of Homer in one kind of way. It was much simpler than that. It was simply going to this story, which seemed to me to have such power, and just looking to see if there was not some little crevices in it where you could work with action that is implied but not told. I mean, for example, I think in the Iliad, it's about 1.5 lines in which we learn about how Patroclus comes to the court and ends up being Achilles' stepbrother, sort of thing. And, I must have read it many, many times and not been struck by it or not noticed it. And it is that extraordinary story of that child who's playing a game of taws with someone and strikes him and kills him and therefore becomes an outcast. And that's a very, very powerful story. But Homer hasn't got time to tell you that. He just reminds you that that's a story. Maybe you've heard it somewhere else. So again, it seemed to me to be a story that could be told, that we could be asked to sort of look at that in separation as part of what goes into the Iliad, but is not actually there. So it was simpler than that.
I hope it's a question. If it's not a question, someone might turn it into a question for me. I was so interested when you said you didn't know whether anyone would like it, and then, of course, there was also a popular response, because even this evening before coming in, but also other of my colleagues and friends here have all said we've just not only bought it for ourselves, but been compelled to buy it for other people. Friends and relatives, very different people. And I would suggest that one of the reasons for that was when I read it, I was so relieved. I had this response of incredible relief that I felt that such an important gesture of moving off your own ground, of moving across the no man's land onto someone else's turf, the painstaking, particular work of it, the imaginative work of it, was exactly what we needed. And I think that's what I wanted also to give to other people. And I've noticed that that's a kind of a chain reaction, that we are in this muddle and no one knows the hell how to get out of it. And we've all talked our way into so many labyrinths that someone actually having a new idea and physically executing that idea off your own ground was an extremely liberating.
That's interesting. I've been astonished by the number of people when they've written to me about it, have actually said, my husband and I read it aloud to one another. Numbers of people have spoken of reading it aloud. That's why I was convinced that it's got something to do with storytelling itself. There's some really healing quality in the telling of stories. And I think I know what some of those things are. And I've said it before. It's partly the way we're invited immediately to occupy someone else's life. And that really relieves us of being ourselves for a time. And whatever our problems are, we're free of them because we're being someone else. That's one thing it may be. But the other one too is that especially in primitive storytelling, which even begins with once upon a time and ends up with ever after, that is somehow about time. And again, what we're relieved of when we're reading hearing the story or reading the story, we're freed of our own bondage to the time we're in, which is really essentially the life of our own body. And there seems to be something in that is very liberating and healing to us. But it's quite strange. I mean, I don't, as I say, it's very difficult to know what happens to books when they go out there. That's the great thing about them. Is, you send them out, and an awful lot of the time you don't hear back. You don't know what's happened to the book, but books do their own kind of work. And, I know everybody these days, especially in publishing, are worried about how you make a book successful. But in fact, there is only one way in which books are successful, and that is that people pick them up and pass them on to someone else, or at least through word of mouth. That is absolutely what sells books. And so even those books, that sell millions, whatever they are, basically it's about some kind of epidemic. It's like a germ being passed on. But the writer doesn't know about that. Certainly the last time he would ever know about it is when he's writing the book.
Is there a last question?
I actually want to turn back to the other part of that quote that you finished with there about stealing other people's lives and casting your mind back to 12 Edmonston Street and the whole alternative universe, as you put it, of the underneath of the house. And I grew up in one of those houses too, and that's still one of my favourite books. The house is no longer there. We've talked about, the life of the body, and the book relieving you of that temporal, constraint. What about your own life? And is there going to be a son of 12 Edmonston Street? Is there going to be another memoir? Can we look forward to that?
Well, look, I've always been surprised when that's called a memoir. And I suppose it is sort of a memoir, but it was something that I think tells, if it tells anything about me, and of course it does, but everything you write tells about you, it doesn't tell all that much because mostly it's about objects. It's about close descriptions of objects and what they meant in the house or spaces. And I think that's about as far as I'd ever want to go. If it's a memoir, it's a memoir at a very strange, oblique angle. And I think one of the very good things that happens to you as you get old, but maybe it doesn't happen to everybody, but certainly happens to me, is the only life that really doesn't much interest you is your own. No, I mean, you dive. I used to sort of think of those things. I once had somebody I taught many, many years ago at school in England who was a very whimsical kind of 16, 17-year-old. And another person in the class was sort of telling some long story about what had happened to him with his usual absorption and his belief that everything that happened to him was interesting. And this other guy said, have you ever thought of that thing that people say about when you're drowned and your whole life is flashing before you? And this guy said, yes. And he said, you'd go to sleep.
Thank you very much for showing your appreciation for David Malouf and Bill Ashcroft for a wonderful evening. Having experienced the unique signature of David Malouf's mind in person, you might like to carry away a signature on one of his books, or maybe one for a friend as well. Yes, and sign up also for New South writing events. I'll flick a slide.